Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Lab 207 webcast. My name is Mr. Kite, and I'll be hanging out with you today as we wrap up our series on waste. The last topic we got to talk about today is hazardous waste. So as always, let me get you some objectives and we'll get going. By the end of this video, you should be able to understand the problem of hazardous waste, explain RCRA and CERCLA legislation, and finally, discuss strategies for reducing waste. That's what we got to finish up our series. So let's begin by talking about hazardous waste, just to get you a definition of it right off the bat. Technically, hazardous waste is defined as liquid, solid, gaseous, or sludge waste that is harmful to humans or ecosystems. I don't know if I can be any more clear than that. If it is waste that is specifically harmful to humans or the ecosystem, it's hazardous waste. So let's talk about some of the sources of hazardous waste. This is the places that hazardous waste typically come from. The biggest producers of hazardous waste is usually industrial processes. This could be manufacturing of textiles, big one, lots of chemicals involved in that. Cleaning of machinery. Any factory, no matter where you are and what you produce, you're going to have to clean your machines. That's probably going to be done using water and solvents. Those chemicals are then going to be considered hazardous waste. Also, many manufacturing processes use chemicals and solvents and paints and things like that to get their job done. So industrial process, big source of hazardous waste, but also there are smaller sources like dry cleaners. Some of the chemicals used in dry cleaning are highly toxic. Auto garages, small farms, small businesses, even households. Households account for a fair portion of the hazardous waste stream too, and that includes things like household cleaners, electronics, fertilizers, gardening chemicals, all that stuff that you use around the house on a daily basis, but don't necessarily consider hazardous waste, could still be labeled hazardous waste. And the sad thing is that of all of the hazardous waste that is produced around the world yearly, only about 5% is recycled, which means dealt with properly. So this means that 95% of hazardous waste materials are being dealt with in a manner that is safe for the environment. So let's talk about the treatment of that waste. Problem with hazardous waste is you can't just take it and throw it into a landfill, because if you toss it into a landfill, then that hazardous waste can get out into the environment or into a waterway or something like that. So all hazardous waste, if it is identified and dealt with properly, usually has to go through a series of chemical reactions that decontaminate the chemicals that were present. Once those chemicals have been decontaminated, then they can be disposed with. One of the things that makes dealing with hazardous waste particularly difficult is that, your house, you might have normal garbage collection on a weekly basis, but there is no easy setup system in most cities where they will just come and pick up your hazardous waste on a weekly basis. So in most cities, what you have to do is hold on to all your hazardous waste throughout the year, and then your city, maybe once or twice a season might have a program where you can bring all of your hazardous waste to a specific area. They will collect it and then take it away and dispose of it properly. So word to the wise, bit of advice: if you have hazardous waste around the house, just collect them and then be on the lookout for one of those hazardous waste disposal events around your city, because like I said, these wastes, they need to go through a series of chemical processes to detoxify them before they can actually be put away or thrown out. Legislation is going to be obviously a really big deal, and when it comes to waste, most of the legislation that has been passed around waste has to deal with hazardous waste, because that's what's done the most environmental damage. It's what's caused the most problems for human health. So therefore, it's gotten the most attention. Things that get the most attention also get legislative work. So there are two pieces of legislation you need to know about: RCRA and CERCLA. I'm also going to talk about Brownfields, which are related. Starting off with RCRA. Now, I'm not talking about the electronics company. I'm talking about the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Major things that you need to know about this act is that it instituted cradle-to-grave tracking of hazardous waste. By cradle-to-grave, what I mean is this tracks hazardous waste from the generation, that would be the cradle, all the way through its disposal, that would be the grave. So this tracks hazardous things all the way through its life cycle. And RCRA focuses minimization and generation Sorry, let me say that again. RCRA minimizes generation and emphasizes proper disposal. So the reason that RCRA tracks things cradle to grave is so at the cradle end it can minimize the actual generation of hazardous waste, and at the grave end it can emphasize proper disposal processes in order to take care of that waste. It also gave law enforcement the ability to punish violators. So there were some amendments put into place known as the Hazardous and Solid Waste Amendments that gave the RCRA the power to actually punish violators of these laws. So that's RCRA. The other one you need to know is CERCLA, also known as the Superfund Act. You will see these two used interchangeably, so associate CERCLA and Superfund. The way that this worked is it imposed a tax on chemical and petroleum companies. Government identified them as being the biggest generators of hazardous waste, so it decided that it would tax those companies in order to generate a revenue stream. That revenue stream was used to fund the cleanup of abandoned hazardous waste sites. So let's say a factory had shut down, the area was completely contaminated and hazardous, but the company has gone away and is not going to be dealing with it. That area is now or would be designated as a Superfund site, which means that it would be eligible to get the funding for outside companies or government to come in and clean up and detoxify that area. Those areas that have been abandoned and designated for cleanup are known as Superfund sites. That's why it's called the Superfund Act. The EPA maintains a national priorities list of these Superfund sites so that there's an idea of what needs to be cleaned up where. All states have got at least one Superfund site except for North Dakota. And the states with the most Superfund sites include New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and I want to say California, though that may be incorrect. A couple problems with CERCLA is, or the biggest problem with CERCLA is that it doesn't have enough funding to complete cleanup. There are many thousands of Superfund sites across America, but the government is not collecting sufficient tax revenue in order to be able to clean up all of those sites. So one Superfund site that you need to know about is Love Canal, and we'll talk about this more in class. But Love Canal is a place where there was a big ditch dug in the ground for 40 or 50 years. I believe it was a photography company used that ditch essentially to dump all of their toxic waste. Once the pit was full, it was just covered over, and then there was a school and a housing development built on top of it. Nobody really told the people in the school and housing development what was under the land. Over time, those chemicals started to seep into the basements of people's homes and out onto lawns and into the school, and they noticed that people in the community were getting really sick at a much higher rate than people in surrounding communities. So investigation was done. It was found that there were tons of toxic chemicals under the ground. The area on top of Love Canal was evacuated, it was cleaned up, and now I believe it is a place where people are able to inhabit the area again because cleanup has been completed, but that is one example of a famous Superfund site. And then there are sites known as brownfields, and brownfields are places that are not contaminated enough to be a Superfund site, but they're too contaminated to be used as is. They're created to help local governments deal with a contaminated area, and they focus on rehabilitation of those areas. Some examples of areas that would qualify as brownfields include old factories, gas stations, waterfront areas, landfills, rail yards, places like that that may have had some association with toxic chemicals and have been abandoned but aren't bad enough to be considered a Superfund site. I will tell you that in urban areas, a rehabilitation of these brownfields is becoming a really popular thing to do because people are realizing, hey, this is land that could be really cool. So here in Durham, we've got the American Tobacco Campus, which was formerly a tobacco manufacturing warehouse. It has been rehabbed and cleaned up, and now it's like shops and apartments and things like that. Another example of this would be the High Line in New York City, where there used to be a train line running. No longer a train line, now it's like a park. Problem with this, or difficulty with this, is with anything else, management varies widely by state. So some states are all about this, some states don't want to spend money on it at all. In some states the cleanup of the area is really good, and in other states it's not so good. So be able to compare and know the difference between a brownfield and a Superfund site. Final thing I want to talk about with hazardous waste is the idea of not my problem. So shipping of waste in search of loose regulations is a big problem. In the developed world, a lot of our manufacturing processes produce this waste that we don't want to necessarily deal with in our part of the world. So we put it on a ship and we send it out to sea looking for a country that is willing to take this waste in exchange for a cash payment. So basically we are trying to pay people money to take our terrible waste. And we're looking for countries that have got looser environmental regulations so that they would be willing to take that waste, knowing that they probably need the money more than they're worried about their environment. But this does go the other way too. There has been cases where manufacturing companies in India don't necessarily have the equipment to deal with the toxic waste that they're producing, so they may ship that to America so that we can deal with it properly. Just know that hazardous waste does not necessarily stay where it's generated. A lot of times it gets shipped to other places to be dealt with. And I want to wrap up this whole series on waste with the idea of life cycle analysis. And this is essentially asking the question of how can we reduce waste in the first place so that we don't have to landfill it, we don't have to incinerate it, we don't have to deal with it as hazardous waste. It is looking at the whole system. So this is going all the way from the extraction of the materials used to produce a product to its recycling or throwing away at the end of its life. And as the life cycle of a product is looked at, everything is considered, including the energy used to extract the waste, energy used to manufacture the product, any toxic chemicals produced during manufacturing of the product, use of the product, breakdown of the product, recycling of the product. And people who do life cycle analysis look at each of these phases and say, all right, where can I reduce the impact on the environment? Where can I use fewer resources? Where can I make recycling easier? Where can I make this thing more biodegradable? So you are looking at the whole life of the product and in each step asking, how can we reduce the impact of this product? It's through life cycle analysis that we get things like the Subaru Zero Waste plant that I talked about, where you now have auto manufacturing in this area that does not put anything into a landfill. Last slide for the day is going to be talking about integrated waste management. Now, way back I talked about integrated pest management or pest control, where the farmers consider all of the possible strategies in order to deal with a pest. Integrated waste management is the same thing. It is looking at an area, looking at the constraints of an area, the type of waste that is generated, and considering all possible approaches to reduce the amount of waste thrown away in an area. So this is going to look different from every city. Some cities may need to focus more on composting, some may need to focus on source reduction, others may need to focus on recycling or incineration. It's going to be unique to the area, but it is a plan that is based specifically on that area. One of the strategies that could be used in integrated waste management is cradle to cradle analysis. So cradle to grave is looking at production to disposal. Cradle to cradle is looking at making products so that they can actually be disassembled and reassembled into something else. So Volkswagen is looking at making their cars such that at the end of the car's life can easily be disassembled so the parts can be recycled. Right there, here in the picture, there's an example of carpet done by a company called Floor. Rather than just rolling out a big old slab of carpet, they do it in carpet tiles so that if one tile gets messed up, you don't have to replace the whole thing, you just buy a new tile and plop it back in. So those would be some examples of cradle to cradle analysis. And with that, I think we are done with our series on waste. I hope you found it helpful. Thanks for joining us on the Lab 207 webcast. My name is Mr. Kite. Hopefully we'll see you again.